Good morning and welcome to Intro to Budgeting. This is Professor Minton. Let me just begin by saying that I hope sincerely that all of you are well and that all of you are taking the necessary precautions to stay that way. I know that for me anyway, it's very frustrating to be hemmed up here in a small area, and I can only imagine those of you who are much younger and have so much more energy are experiencing the same kind of things and many times over. But do be aware that, as I've probably mentioned to you before, we have more scientists at Georgia Tech today than existed in the entire world in 1910, and we have a extremely complex artificial intelligence apparatus that together all of these elements are working on solving this problem, and I have every expectation that they will do that sooner rather than later. I do expect that just the normal course of viruses is they tend to die out during the summer anyway. So I know that we'll probably very shortly be back to normal, even though the new normal is probably going to be a little bit different, at least for the first few months as we recover from this thing. So um, that's all I wanted to say about that part. Now, let me just mention to you, those of you who are in this class, you do have an examination upcoming, I think on Thursday. I have not yet put it together. I will do that tomorrow. And when I put it together tomorrow, I'll also do a little presentation giving you a heads up on what you may expect to see on that. And I may even do a very quick, um, maybe set of questions that you can expect to see. Okay, so I know for those of you who are used to dealing with face-to-face classes or being in face-to-face classes, this is a different experience. Um, I'll try to make it as painless as possible, but we do have to work our way through it, and we will. I can promise you that we'll get through this and move on to bigger and better things very soon, very shortly. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so first of all, this is probably going to be the shortest presentation that you've ever seen, slide presentation, because it's only two slides. And the reason is that because I want to take this budgeting process one step at a time. The first step is always going to be sales, but sales at a quite complex area. So in the case of a manufacturing company, we have to know certain things. And by the way, nothing happens in any business until you sell something, and that includes even a nonprofit. A nonprofit, let's take a school for example. A school has to have students. A school has to sell tuition and the learning experience. Otherwise, it can't not stay around. It can't stay in business. Well, I guess it could if it's state mandated, but it's even then it's very difficult. Um, so nothing happens until we sell something, and that's an important consideration. Because that's the case, it is the most important element of a budget, and it takes the greatest amount of time for us to put together. Now, what do we have to consider? Well, we have to consider our prices. What kind of competition do we have uh, on price? Do we get a lot of competition from outside this country, from lower cost areas where they may be able to sell it in for a considerably lower price? And how do we compete with that? What do we do? How do we get more efficient? To be able to lower our own prices? Do we, in the short run, have to lower prices just to keep our current market share? Do we have a situation where we have a rather unique product, or we've positioned ourselves in the market in such a way that we're able to get a premium price? Take Apple. Apple is able to get a premium price on their phones because of the way that they've positioned their products, which is a great thing because they have established some distinctives that allow them to do that. A lot of companies are unable to make such distinctives. And think about commodities as an example. If I'm in the sugar business, then I have very little opportunity to make my business distinctive. Now, I can try, and you see them try, but it's quite difficult for them, and that's the reason that you don't see a whole lot of advertising for sugar. You don't see a whole lot of advertising for salt, mustards, and things like that, simply because those are treated more like commodities, and because the margins are so slim on commodities, you don't see a whole lot of advertising because it generally doesn't move the dial that much. So in some areas, you just don't have much choice as it relates to the price. We have to look at volumes. What's our volume going to look like going forward? And in other words, are we losing volume? Are we losing market share? Are we gaining market share? If we're losing market share, how do we combat that? And if we're gaining market share, what are we doing right that we may be able to extend through some of the other product lines that we have? So all of those things are important considerations, and they'll take up a lot of our time discussing whether or not we have any way to move our price up. If we have to lower our price, what do we do? How does that affect all the downstream costs and our profitability beyond that? So the sales area is just incredibly important um, to understand. And again, it'll take the greatest amount of our time because we're going to look through our product lines very specifically. We're going to look through our customers very specifically. What are our largest customers doing? What are our largest customers telling us about our product? Do we have some failures in terms of product quality? And if we do, how do we deal with that product quality issue or issues? Um, are we responding to customers that well in terms of speed? It used to be that the lowest price won the day, but now I think there's also um, an incredible push toward delivering your product and in a very fast way. And by the way, there's all sorts of research being done on what they call the last mile of delivery because that's the most expensive part of putting together a sale. How do we deal with that? The last portion of the transportation cost. We have to look at our mix. As you can well imagine, every product has its own margin. So if I have 50 products, I'll have 50 margins. Um, every product may take some more material or some less material. It may have its own stressors in terms of competition and those sorts of things. And I think I've mentioned to you before, it's very possible for you to have $1 million in sales this month and have a 10% profit margin, and next month have $1 million in sales and have a 20% profit margin. And that generally is related to your product mix. How many of a certain type product are you selling? Now, obviously, what we want to do is we want to be able to move our best products as quickly as we can, and our worst products, we want to move those a little bit slower. Okay, you can't be all of your products are not going to have the same margins, and for reasons that we've already talked about a little bit, competition is probably the biggest one these days because there are almost no products that don't have some level of competition associated with them. We also have to think about, are we going to do any special events? So if you are selling to the retail market, then we have some big days or big events that happen throughout the year. For instance, you have Mother's Day, you have Father's Day, you have Easter, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Halloween. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. Secretary's Day. I mean, there are just all sorts of things that happen throughout the year, and so we have to be looking at when those events come up, are we going to try to push some product through the market? Um, what's our strategy for doing that? Generally, when we get ready to do an event like that, in order to push as many products through the market as possible, we have to look at reductions or discounting the product on that particular event time. And if we do discount the product, how does that impact our cost volume profit analysis? Um, what is the timing of the event? So we have to keep our customers informed as to what we'd like to do. We may have to split some costs with those customers. In other words, we may have some cooperative advertising things or promotions that we do. And there are just lots and lots of different implications that sales has in how we move these products through our channels, through our sales channels. So when we get into that area, expect to take a good bit of time there because, again, it is by far and away the most important area in the budget is what are we selling, where are we selling it to, what's our mix going to look like, what's our price going to be, um, how much do we think we can move through in an event, and all those sorts of things. So you'll find that that's a pretty involved area, and we'll take a good bit of time with it. Okay, so and when we do our sales budget, once we've done that, in this particular budget that we're going to be looking at, it impacts our production. And so, what are our manpower needs going to be? And how do we get there? Well, every product that we produce is going to have a materials list. It's going to have called a bill of materials. It's going to have the direct labor implications on those materials. In other words, how much time do I have to spend to produce this particular product? And as you can well imagine, if you're producing a mouse, okay, and you're producing a coffee cup, those two things are going to be vastly different in terms of the labor content um, and probably the materials content. You know, the coffee cup that I'm sitting here looking at is a much bigger thing than the mouse that I'm looking at over here. And one's made out of plastic, one's made out of other materials, and porcelain in this case, I think. And cheers, by the way. That's one of the great things about being home. You can sit there with your Pop Tarts and eat your Pop Tarts, which, by the way, is of course the perfect food because you have some carbohydrates in it. It's very quick to make. It's got some fruit in it. I mean, who doesn't like fruit, right? I mean, when you're done with it, you can take the aluminum foil and make yourself a little hat out of it in case you have an alien invasion. I mean, it's a wonderful food. Anyway, so we have this bill of materials, and it tells us exactly um, how many pounds of material or fractions of a pound of material go into a particular product, and we have the cost associated with that material. And as you can well imagine, what happens is the more sophisticated our system is, the more sophisticated we can get with these materials and bill of materials. Now, typically, what happened in the past is we'd create a bill of materials, and from that bill of materials, we'd have some standard costs associated with it. In other words, I'd stop the process and I'd say, okay, this is the cost of our materials. And then what we would do is we would throw off variances based upon did we do a better job of sourcing those materials or did we do a poor job of sourcing those materials? Do we have any waste? If we have, that's called a usage variance. You have, on the one hand, you have a price variance, and on the other hand, you have a usage variance that we have to consider. Um, then we have to consider what kind of an activity base do we have for overhead. And what I've used on the particular one that I've sent you, that'll be based on machine hours. I think more and more often in this country, anyway, because we have such high labor rates vis-a-vis, say, a China or Jamaica or a lot of other places, our labor rates are in fact mandated by the government. Um, and we have taxes that go along with those. We have expectations from employees for vacation time, for family leave time, um, for sick days, all of those sorts of things that have to be factored in that a lot of countries in very low and let's call them the developing areas, they may not have. I know back when I was working in this area in particular, um, we were looking at plant sites in various locations around the globe, and I spent a great deal of my time down in South America and Central America, and some of those areas in the Caribbean, and in those areas, the price of labor is much less expensive than it is in this country. So, for example, now this has been many years ago, so I know that the price of labor, even in those countries, has gone up. It's gone up over here too, relatively speaking. But back in those days, the cost of labor, say in Mexico, for example, was around 50 cents an hour fringed with fringe benefits. And here in this country, you were looking at back in those days, you were looking at a $5 or $6 an hour minimum wage, and then you fringe it up another 30%. Fringes mean those things that I talked about earlier, vacation time and sick leave and all of those sorts of things, the taxes that a company has to pay. So, we talked a little bit about this already. So, if I hire somebody and they pay Social Security and Medicare of 7.65%, then the company has to provide a match for that. And those are considered to be fringe benefits because we're paying part of the employee's old age retirement. We also have pension plans that we put into, 401ks, those sorts of things. All of those things that we do here in this country, a lot of other countries do not do. And so for them, they just have maybe a very small tax rate and they have a very small labor that they get. Some of these countries, their per capita income is $6,000, $7,000 a year. And even now, if you take a look at the CIA World Fact Book, and that's a very interesting thing, by the way, to do. It's a little bit off the topic, but maybe not so much so. If you go to if you type into Google CIA Fact Book, World Fact Book, what you get is an area where you can look at all of the information the CIA has accumulated on every country in the world, and they've looked at every country, including our own. They look at, say, purchasing power parity. In other words, how far do their dollars go? And I know that the last time I looked, and this has been no, probably not that long ago, just a few months ago. China, for example, their money goes further than ours, and they were number one in the world in purchasing power parity. So, in that sense, they were already the world's number one economy. I don't know where this will all shake out when it's done with the current problem that we have, but I suspect that there will be some fairly significant changes, at least short term, because of this. I know Europe is having severe problems with it, and it's going to impact their economy and their economies and our economies um, as well. So, um, take a look at that because I think you'll find it to be pretty interesting and I think even eye-opening when you see that when you look at our level of per capita income versus the level of per capita income, say, in Guatemala. And when you look at those kinds of things, um, and I'm not trying to pick on Guatemala, I'm just saying that that is an example. Bolivia, any of those countries in South America, any of the countries in the Far East, Thailand or Vietnam, any of those countries, I think you'll find that the per capita incomes relative to our per capita income is very small. And that also indicates that their levels of support in terms of what the companies do for their employees is considerably less. So that has to be taken into effect. And what we see then in our country is in order to stay competitive, we have to be able to do things with automation that maybe other countries aren't required to do yet. Even then, when you think about what happens as we respond to low labor rates around the world, we also move some of that automation offshore, and so now we get automation coupled with very low labor content. And what that allows you to do is go down and buy an iron at your local Dollar General for $10. Okay, you wouldn't if this was made in the United States, so you wouldn't be able to do that even with our levels of automation. So those are things that we have to consider because it runs into, if you look a little bit further down on this page, you'll see the idea of sourcing considerations. Where are we going to source these products from? Will we do it? Will we do it locally? Will we have to go to China or Vietnam or someplace else, or Mexico or Canada, someplace else to get these products? And what does that do to our supply line? What does it do to our inventory requirements? Do we have to carry more inventory in order to have these longer supply lines, or what we call the supply chain, or sometimes even called the value chain? Um, and so all of these things come into play when you start thinking about a budget. Um, if we're going to invest in automation, and you see a lot of that happening at Amazon, for example, in their move toward robotics for doing some of these stocking activities. So, what kind of capital needs are involved in that? If you go into some of these McDonald's and you find a kiosk there where you place your order, what's the cost of these kiosks? And so when you start developing these budgets, you have to consider what kind of capital needs you're going to have. Almost all companies, especially manufacturing companies, are always looking for better, faster, cheaper machines. So as we go through, we're not going to get into um, uh, capital needs specifically probably in terms of, well, we're going to buy this machine versus that machine versus another machine. No, we're not going to do that. But we are going to at least put together some sort of a capital budget just based on whim, if you will. That gives you an idea that a capital budget has to be created as well. Capital budgets take cash, they take money. So, how do we generate the cash? So, we're going to have a cash budget. All of these sorts of things, they all are interwoven into our budgeting process. Again, it's quite complex, and I think you'll see that going forward. And so I think I'm going to stop here with this just to give, because I'm just trying to introduce you to the area. And then sometime this afternoon, time permitting, I'm going to open up the actual budget that I sent you, and we will start videoing that. Now, that's a little bit more involved of a process, but I'm going to do it as I'm going to take it in sections, and I'll start with the sales section. Again, we'll talk about how we, as you see the things that we put together, we'll talk about the kinds of considerations that have to be undertaken in order to be able to put those together. It's complex, but it's also quite a bit of fun, actually, trying to figure out how we can outcompete the next guy. I mean, we're a competitive country and we are in a competitive environment. So there's a certain amount of, how do we do better than other nations do and other companies do in order to be able to create a product that is both higher in quality and lower in cost. So um, without going into that in any greater detail, I'm going to close this one out, and then we'll go from there. All right. See you later.